Welcome to Crisis Management. I'm Alicja Siekierska. On today's episode, the federal election is in full swing and federal leaders are making their pitch to Canadians across the country. And so we'll take a look at a poll that shows what the top issue is on the minds of voters today. And we'll also dig into the Conservative Party's proposed GST holiday, plus how the parties are approaching proof of vaccination and vaccine mandates. To get through all this, I am joined by Sean Speer. Sean is a fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum. He previously served as senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he is here to help us dig through the policy issues brought forward by COVID-19. Sean, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alicia.
So let's kick things off with the federal election. A new Maru public opinion poll has found that improving the cost of living and affordability is the top election issue on the mind of Canadian voters. Now, when asked to pick their top two issues of the election, 28% of Canadians selected improving cost of living and affordability. Tackling climate change came in second with 23% support, followed by curtailing government spending and growing the economy. So it seems that, as with most elections, pocketbook issues are very much top of mind for Canadians this time around. Sean, what do you make of these poll results and the fact that pocketbook issues are so important to Canadians for this election?
I think it's a fascinating result, except as you said, Alicia, that's not necessarily uncommon, that oftentimes when we get ourselves into elections, these are some of the issues that Canadians will raise in these types of polls. But I think it's fair to say that Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal Party opted to pursue an election in the summer because they wanted to in effect, put to the Canadian public competing visions for Canada's post-pandemic recovery. The government tabled a pretty ambitious budget back in April that covered a wide range of areas from childcare to clean technology and virtually everything in between. And I think it saw the ballot question is primarily about which party had the more ambitious vision for post-pandemic recovery. Listeners will know that one of the early election ads from the Liberal Party talks about being relentless. And I think what these polling data are telling us is that Canadians aren't seeing this as a kind of a competing visions in a big macro sense, but rather who's going to help them address pretty micro affordability questions, and that may be a ballot question that sets up things better for the opposition parties than the one that Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal Party might have envisioned when they kicked off this campaign last Sunday.
I think that's right. I spoke to Maru Executive Vice President John Wright about this, and he actually said that exact thing, that the opposition, the Conservatives and the NDP, the campaigns that they're running so far are much more in line with what the voters are saying in this poll, that cost of living and affordability are the issues that they want to be addressed, whereas the Liberals have been focusing on those items that, Justin Trudeau announced the daycare program, which we've known about since March. So do you think the parties are doing enough to address these issues right now?
Well, it's an interesting question. As you say, the Liberal Party's plan seems to be that they can talk about measures that were outlined in the April budget, and that can sustain them through the campaign. And at least early days, that hasn't been the case. That the parties that are announcing new specific measures that are more responsive to these public concerns around affordability seem to be kind of driving the agenda. I think it's too early to say, Alicia, what will ultimately be the ballot question. My sense is that most people aren't quite engaged at this point in the campaign, that Canadians will start to take much greater notice and attention in early September. And so that gives Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal Party a bit of time to adjust their message. It's notable, for instance, that of the three major parties, the Liberals are the only ones that haven't released their platform, which may give them even time to call an audible on some of the policy ideas that they want to be talking about in this campaign. But I think that's a long way of saying, at least in the early days, this is not the election that Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal parties envisioned. And, for that reason, I think it may be more interesting and ultimately tighter than most commentators and pollsters were even contemplating, 10 days ago.
Mm-hmm. We will be keeping track of this issue with Maru public opinion polls to keep tabs on what Canadian voters are keeping an eye on through the election. But before we move on to a policy that's aimed on tackling the affordability problem, I do want to talk about inflation, which kind of ties into what we've been discussing, this cost of living and affordability concern. Inflation in Canada rose 3.7% year over year in July, the highest level since May 2011. Now, this figure was more than what economists had expected for July and above that target range that the Bank of Canada is comfortable with, between 1% and 3%. Now, on this chart, you can see from Statistics Canada that dark blue line is the consumer price index. The light blue one below it is excluding the price of gasoline. Now, prices rose at a faster year-over-year pace in 6 of 8 major categories, with housing prices contributing the most, but food prices also jumped 1.7%. Now, Sean, there's debate over whether this spike is temporary or not. It's a debate that's happening not only in Canada and the United States and around the world. But setting that aside, how do you see this information, this development, perhaps impacting, let's start with the federal election. How is that going to have an impact on it?
Well, I think in a couple of ways. The first, Alicia, is that one can't help but think that that the party leaders will need to articulate views about the Bank of Canada's mandate going forward. Viewers will probably know that the Government of Canada sets the inflation framework for the Bank of Canada on a multi-year basis. The current framework is up for renewal this year. And so it seems to me, and I suspect many people watching, that how the different party leaders think about the bank's mandate in general and inflation targeting in particular is one of the most consequential economic policy questions that will face the incoming government. Yesterday, Prime Minister Trudeau was asked about the inflation policy framework. He was mostly dismissive, and there has been some blowback to his answer. It was perceived, I think it's fair to say, as dismissive and not taking it very seriously. I suspect that will force all of the party leaders to up their game. And for the first time in a long time, Alicia, I think the kind of question of Bank of Canada policy may loom larger in the context of a federal election than it has. And I think that's probably a healthy thing. We want an independent central bank, of course, when it comes to individual decision making. But it is the role of politics, kind of properly understood, to sort of set the framework in which those choices are ultimately made. So that's a long way of saying, if you would have guessed that Bank of Canada mandate would be on the policy agenda in this election, you'd be right. Most probably wouldn't have guessed that, but yesterday's inflation number, I think, almost certainly means it will be.
I do think people often think of the Bank of Canada as, not being political, that they don't want politics involved in that. But you're right. The mandate is something that I think is inherently political. It's something that needs to be decided on. Do you think it's getting enough spotlight in this election, or is the fact that when Trudeau was asked about it and kind of, I think it's fair to say, stumbled on that answer, that this is going to force all the leaders to come to the table with some concrete ideas in terms of what they see the mandate being going forward?
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things in response to that question, Alicia, if I may. The first is, as you mentioned in the introduction, I previously worked for Stephen Harper, and I can tell you that decision around renewal of the Bank of Canada mandate is something that then Prime Minister Harper and then Finance Minister Flaherty spent a great deal of time thinking about, analyzing, and before a decision was made. So it really is indeed, one of the most important decisions a government makes, precisely because once you've established the mandate, you then in effect kind of cede control to the central bank to make individual decisions. So getting that kind of mandate right matters a lot. And then, as you say, I think a combination of yesterday's surprising inflation number and Mr. Trudeau's answer to the question about the Bank of Canada mandate, I think will undoubtedly place pressure on Mr. Singh and Mr. O'Toole, and ultimately Mr. Trudeau, to provide greater detail about their respective positions around, complicated questions about, the right inflation target, balancing concerns around full employment, some of the extraordinary monetary practices that we've seen from the Bank of Canada in the course of the pandemic. I think all of those things, ought to be on the table in a kind of healthy debate. And I think you can separate those mandate questions out from, and at the same time, kind of protect the independence of the bank on interest rate decisions and so on.
It's interesting. This is definitely not the election. The election is not shaping up in the way that I expected it to in the early days. I think it's turned out to be a lot more substantive, although, as you said, there is a long way to go. But I do want to continue talking about this affordability question. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole has proposed a GST tax holiday for the month of December that he says would help struggling Canadians while also supporting businesses that have been hit hard by the pandemic. Here's what O'Toole had to say yesterday about the proposed policy.
We have a housing crisis in Canada. We have a cost of living crisis in Canada. We have inflation for the first time in decades being an issue due to Mr. Trudeau's spending, due to a lack of confidence in our economy. And I want to see more of these toys in homes this holiday season. December is going to be the end of a very difficult year for Canada, and we think Canadian families deserve a break.
So the plan would only apply to in-store purchases, meaning that if you bought something off Amazon, you will not get a GST-free purchase. There are also going to be exclusions for things like vehicles, alcohol, and tobacco. The policy so far has received mixed reviews. The president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business called it a bit gimmicky and said that this would actually just shift holiday spending or just general spending from one month to another. But Sean, let's dig into this policy because I think it's really interesting. What do you see the goal of this GST holiday? What are the Conservatives hoping to achieve with this?
Beside advancing their electoral fortunes, I suspect it's about a perception that there may be ongoing demand issues coming out of the pandemic-induced recession. This is something, Alicia, that we've spoken a great deal about on this program over the past several weeks and months. To what extent is the recession a supply-driven recession that's primarily a consequence of restrictions and lockdowns on the economy, and how much of it is a demand-driven recession representing consumers and investors sort of withdrawing from the economy. And I think most evidence points to the fact that it's primarily a supply-side recession. That is to say, as the economy opens up, consumers and investors will return to pre-pandemic activities without much hesitation. This policy seems to assume that that's not going to be enough, that they're going to need some kind of nudge or jolt to encourage a resumption of normal consumer and investor activities. And I think, it seems to me that question is largely an open one. But it's worth observing a couple things. First of all, I've seen some evidence that retail sales in December can be as much as 30% of the year's total sales, which means that a GST holiday in that month could produce significant revenue loss for the government, something perhaps of the magnitude of $10 billion. And then there's the question that Dan Kelly raises, how much of this is incremental consumer behavior as opposed to just shifting consumer behavior that would have happened, in a kind of more steady trajectory over the course of several months. So that's, I guess, a long way of saying, I think the politics of this may be better than the policy. But, if you were going to make a policy case, it would be about trying to stimulate consumer demand after the past 18 months of pretty constrained economic activity.
Yeah, and I do. It's clearly about that demand question, although I was reading through some of the inflation data, and while a lot of it is that supply issues that we're seeing coming through and leading to higher prices on things like vehicles, there is some demand as the economies open up, and that is also contributing. Obviously not in a way that it was pre-pandemic, and clearly still a concern. But is there perhaps a more strategic way that the Conservatives could approach this kind of a policy and make it so that it is more helpful to businesses or perhaps to lower income Canadians and helps make things more affordable? Is there a more focused way to do this?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's a fascinating question, Alicia. I have to think about it. My initial reaction is that the best thing that governments can do to support the resumption of normal consumer and investor activity is one, to get as many people vaccinated as possible, and two, there may be an argument that some businesses need to invest in different capital improvements in order to give people confidence that they can go into those businesses without, being in close proximity with others, being able to social distance and this sort of thing. I think you could make the case that the government should be supporting those capital investments, because that's a kind of crucial ingredient to, to consumers feeling confident that they can fully participate in the economy. But I would just say this. We've actually kind of run this experiment in some ways because we haven't been just closed the entire time, because at different times over the past 16 months or so, restrictions have lessened and then been reimposed. We've actually seen that in those moments or periods when the economy and society reopens a bit, unemployment rate falls pretty quickly, consumer activities restored relatively quickly. I think that gives you a sense that something like this GST holiday may not be necessary to get people back out into stores and to get the economy going again.
Although who knows how this fourth wave will turn out, so maybe it will be more necessary. Before we move on to the next topic, though, I do want to kind of get your thoughts on the big picture here of what this policy, which is, I think it's fair to say, is kind of a marquee one for the Conservatives through this election, what this kind of tax cut says about their overall election strategy and what it says maybe about how they are approaching this pandemic recovery.
It's a good question. I mean, it seems to me, one, they felt like they needed to speak to the immediacy of post-pandemic recovery and have a kind of signature item that spoke to concerns about getting out of the recession and supporting, consumer spending and hiring and so on. What's interesting about it, Alicia, is at different times, Erin O'Toole has sort of talked about being a conservative that's concerned about low-income Canadians, that's concerned about working-class Canadians, including in the service sector. Those have been messages, and targeted messages to an audience that isn't always been a kind of conservative priority. And I think one could make the case that this is part of that kind of small p populist package that is trying to target voters who've not necessarily been part of the conservative voter universe in the past. But I think we'll now wait to see what Mr. Trudeau has to say. I do think, notwithstanding my comments that the policy justification of this may not be strong, I suspect that it will have some salience, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming days we see a kind of counter proposal from the Liberal Party that similarly aims to speak both to concerns around the economic recovery, but in particular the economic conditions of low-income workers in the service industry who, of course, bore the brunt of the pandemic-induced recession over the past several months.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sean, just before the election was called, the Liberals announced that they would be making COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for public servants, as well as those working in federally regulated industries. And they also announced that anyone traveling by plane or train would have to be fully vaccinated to do so. It seemed that Trudeau was aiming to set this up as a wedge issue for the election, and it has remained a topic on the campaign trail. Take a listen.
Unless people have a medical exception, they will not be able to board a plane or a train in Canada if they are unvaccinated. That is about protecting our young people. It's about protecting Canadians. We are absolutely unequivocal on that, because this is how we get through this pandemic.
But in some cases where we can use daily rapid testing, masking and all other measures, we need to bring people together, not divide. We need to get people vaccinated, but also have a plan in cases where they're not.
Now, as you heard there, the Conservatives do have a different plan, which would require those that are not vaccinated to show a recent negative test for traveling. And then for federal workers, it would be daily rapid tests. The NDP said they would implement a vaccine mandate for federal workers, and the Greens are also considering it. But Sean, let's talk about vaccine mandates. Something it seems that the broad Canadian public does support based on recent polling that we have done. What do you make of these slightly different approaches among the federal parties?
Well, it's fascinating. As you say, it was clearly designed as a wedge issue. It was something the government announced on Friday before the launch of the election on Sunday, and then Mr. Trudeau profiled on Monday, his first full day of campaigning. I think he did that precisely because, as you say, vaccine mandates appear popular within the Canadian population, but slightly less so amongst conservative voters, which is the kind of challenge that Mr. O'Toole finds himself in. On one hand, he needed to be able to say something that would be responsive to those prospective conservative voters who support mandates, while at the same time not alienating core conservative voters who seem to have slightly higher levels of apprehension than the public as a whole. I don't know what you think, Alicja. My sense is after kind of Monday or Tuesday of debate around this issue, that the outcome was kind of sufficiently muddied that it's not entirely clear to me what the distinctions are between the different policies, because Mr. O'Toole clearly thought that he had misspoke or that he didn't go far enough, and the Conservative Party scrambled to release a kind of more fleshed out policy on Monday evening that included some of the parts that you've described, including rapid testing and so on. At the same token, the Liberal Party position seemed to be diminished a bit after some criticism from public sector unions, and in the end, whether the consequences of not being vaccinated under the Liberal plan are less than clear. So, I suspect that vaccine mandates, vaccine passports will continue to be a significant part of this campaign. But at least in this opening salvo, I would say that it probably in the end served to obscure more than it did clarify how the different parties are going to kind of handle these issues.
It does sound like the Liberals are still working with the federally regulated industries, such as like the airline industry, on sorting out this policy. And it is, you're right, it's not clear what this means for unvaccinated workers and if there will be accommodations made. It doesn't sound like they will for travelers, as you heard there, but you're right, it does seem like a muddy waters issue where it's not very clear where everyone stands. I should note, actually, from that survey about the top election issues, it doesn't seem like mandating vaccinations for federal government and its regulated employees and companies and agencies is a top priority. It just said 4% listed that as a top election issue. So clearly people care about vaccines and getting out on the other side of this pandemic, but perhaps it isn't the wedge issue that the Liberals were necessarily hoping it is. Ontario also announced this week that it's going to be taking a different approach and announced that healthcare workers will have to be fully vaccinated or take part in regular testing. So not totally mandating vaccines. But given vaccines seem to be the best way for us to get out of this pandemic and keep the economy open, do you think that kind of approach strikes a reasonable balance? Is that enough? What do you think?
For what it's worth, Alicja, my personal preference would be that the provinces move ahead with vaccine passports. So not quite going as far as mandatory vaccinations, but putting in place a system where people who aren't vaccinated, could be subject to greater restrictions in terms of participating fully in the economy or society than those of us who are vaccinated. My primary sort of apprehension about mandatory vaccines is it's not precisely clear that it would withstand a charter challenge, given charter protections for religious liberty and so on. It may in the end, but I'm not sure it's worth the risk, given that vaccine passports can get us a lot of the way there. The only thing I just mentioned quick, Alicia, we've just talked both about, the question of vaccine mandates at the national level and the provincial level. Maybe it's worth emphasizing for viewers who, don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about Canadian federalism. The reason, of course, this is happening is because the federal government only regulates about 6 or 7% of the national labor force. In other words, provinces are the ones primarily responsible for, would be primarily responsible for putting in place vaccine mandates that would cover the vast swath of Canada's economy. Ottawa is really restricted to the federal public service. And then those sectors, like some of the ones you mentioned, rail, air, telecommunications, banking, that are subject to federal regulation. So we're going to sort of have to have a hodgepodge of different policies in place here, and that's primarily an expression of Canadian federalism more than anything else.
Yeah, you're definitely seeing the jurisdictional issues come more clear in this pandemic, I think more clear than ever before. But Sean, before we wrap up the show, I did want to mention one more story. As you are well aware, the Canadian long-term care facilities were among the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, putting much strain on employees working in these facilities. But one of Canada's largest long-term care home operators has decided to reward its employees to recognize their work through this challenging time. The Globe and Mail featured a story about Sienna Senior Living, which is awarding $3 million worth of shares to its 13,000 employees. All full-time workers will receive $500 worth of stock, and part-time workers will get $300. The goal is to not only reward employees, but to help, the Globe says, foster a sense of ownership in the company. Sean, what do you think of this kind of bonus incentive from Sienna Senior Living?
Well, I mean, I would say, it represents a good thing. As you said, many of these workers have put themselves at significant risk in the context of the pandemic, and so, I think it's both wise and just that their contribution is being recognized. The cynic in me can't help but think that private operators in this industry are feeling self-conscious about the prospect of potential nationalization, a growing role for the public sector in the delivery of long-term care. We've certainly seen different voices arguing that the poor performance in long-term care facilities is a function of the reliance on private operators. And so, something like this, probably isn't the worst kind of public relations move in light of those growing demands. But, setting that aside, I think just in sum, anything we can do to honor and recognize those so-called essential workers who've, made such an important contribution over the course of the pandemic, I think is a good thing, full stop. And, I'm pleased to see that this company is doing it. And given its kind of size and magnitude in the sector, Alicia, one can't help but suspect that we'll see others feel compelled to put forward kind of similar arrangements for their workers. So it may be a nice kind of domino effect for these people who kind of deserve our admiration and respect.
Yeah, especially as you're seeing the labor market tightening, and I wonder how much that has also played into this decision. But I essentially agree with everything that you said there. So I think it's a good place to end it. That is all the time that we have for today's show. Thank you so much for the conversation, Sean.
Thanks as always, Alicia.
Now, if you want to rewatch this episode or get more news about the coronavirus pandemic, please visit the Yahoo Finance Canada website. For more bonus content, make sure you check out our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you have any questions for Sean or feedback about the show, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'm at alicia@yahoofinance.com. Thanks for tuning in.